Welcome everybody to AP World History Modern live stream. Today we're going to talk about Unit 8, Topic 3, the effects of the Cold War. Before we get started, I want to introduce myself. My name is Chad Smith, and I'm from Dallas area in Texas. Technically, I'm from a town called Irving, and I work at MacArthur High School in Dallas, Texas. Before we get started in today's activity, I want to take an opportunity to review yesterday's assignment from Mr. Logereau. Yesterday, Mr. Logereau talked to you about the beginning of the Cold War and understanding the Cold War throughout the 20th century. And he showed you two different documents and asked you to analyze the source of each document. Today, I'm going to take a brief moment to look at each document and recognize a possible source analysis for each one. This is the first document he showed you. It's a memorandum written by the Assistant Secretary of State in the United States of America about attempting or supporting an overthrow, a coup d'etat, of the government in Iran. One possible way to analyze this source is to look at the historical situation. The historical situation is that this source takes place during an American policy called containment. Containment is the American policy of stopping the spread of communism at all costs. And it also takes place in the US disdain for Soviet Union and communism. It's important to note here that the Assistant Secretary of State mentions that the threat to the Iranian government is the Communist Party of Iran, and that the Communist Party is the Soviet Union. He brings up this threat more than once throughout the document and reinforces it by talking about the Soviet Union, which emphasizes the threat the Iranian government poses, not to itself, but to the United States of America. This is not the only possible way that you could go about sourcing document 1. So if you came up with other options for sourcing document 1, I encourage you to also find a moment to talk to your teachers and ask them about this document. A second document is this victory carpet from Afghanistan. One way to source this document is through looking at the author's point of view. The individual who made this victory carpet did so after the organization, the Mujahideen, had become victorious against the Soviet Union. Being victorious against the Soviet Union was no small feat. They were one of the two global superpowers, the strongest governments in the world. And to compete with them was an extraordinary accomplishment. So this author demonstrates her pride or his pride in several ways. By writing "Made in Afghanistan" at the bottom of the rug, by writing "Long Life" in the middle of Afghanistan, and by showing tanks, and what seems to be busted tanks, leaving Afghanistan, returning to the Soviet Union. Again, this is one of many different possible ways to source this, to analyze the source of this document. So if you came up with another way, please take time to talk to your teacher about it and ask how your response works out. Now let's take a moment to get ready for today's activity by doing a warm-up. Here I have for you a secondary source. This secondary source is about the Cold War. What I want you to do is take a minute to read the secondary source and respond to the prompt in large letters at the top of the screen. Provide one piece of historical evidence not mentioned in the passage to support these authors' argument about the origins of the Cold War. Take a moment to read the source and respond to the prompt. Hopefully you've had enough time to look at this source and think about at least one piece of historical evidence not mentioned in the passage that can support the author's argument. Let's look at some potential answers. Before we can think about specific historical evidence that supports this author's claim, we have to identify what the author's claim is making. So what does the author say about the origins of the Cold Wars? Well, in this document, the author says that the origin of the Cold War is in the mid-1940s. That means we're looking for evidence that supports the idea that the origin of the Cold War, or the rivalry between the two states, is rooted in the 1940s. One potential way to answer this question is to talk about various disagreements between the Soviet Union and the United States that took place at World War II peace conferences. You may remember discussing the peace conference of Yalta, the Yalta Conference, or the Tehran Conference. Both of these peace conferences were opportunities to develop a way to set up peace after World War II. But in both of these peace conferences, it became abundantly clear that the one thing that united the United States and the Soviet Union was their disdain toward Germany. And once Germany was defeated, there would be no common thread holding them together. So Soviet desire to conquer and rule over certain Eastern European states and strategy about how to handle Japan created significant differences between the two states. Another example is the emergence of the United States and the Soviet Union as two clear global superpowers after World War II. After World War II, these were the two states with the strongest industrial capacity and the least amount of effort and energy to put into rebuilding their own states. Because their systems of life and cultures were so different, it led to them having natural rivalries after World War II. A third potential answer to this question is the increased industrial demand because of World War II drastically improved the economy of both states. As a result of World War II, both the Soviet Union and the United States came into the mid-1940s with very strong economic situations. They had significant industrial demand and high employment rates. And so both of them were interested in demonstrating why their systems were the best. Another potential answer is nuclear proliferation. While in 1945, when the war ended, only the United States had demonstrated the ability to use nuclear or atomic technology, by the end of the 1940s, the Soviet Union had demonstrated that they also had this technology. All four of these things serve as reasons for the Cold War, but they also serve as reasons that the Cold War can be traced to the mid-1940s. There are also some common incorrect responses here. The opposing economic ideologies is certainly one of the most prominent causes of the Cold War. The fact that communism was the economic system of the Soviet Union and capitalism was the economic system in the United States of America. While that is unquestionably true, it is not a correct response to this prompt because it is not evidence that shows the mid-1940s as the origin of the Cold War. The Soviet Union had been a communist state since 1917, and the United States had used capitalism even before its creation as a country in 1776. So this is not a good answer to this prompt. It is not good evidence for this author's argument. In the same way, the opposing political ideologies of totalitarianism in the Soviet Union and democracy in the United States is not a good response to this prompt. Again, this is absolutely a cause of the Cold War. However, this is not traced back to the mid-1940s. It can be traced back to the creation of both of these two countries, serving to be a much more enduring cause of the Cold War. Hopefully you guys are feeling revved up and ready to go now that we've had an opportunity to get into and review some of the things that we've learned and practice some important skills. At this point, I want to take a moment to answer the question, why are we learning material from Unit 8 and 9 if the AP test is only going to cover material from Units 1 through 6. And I'll let you know two things. One, I think one of the most important reasons is because while we're being tested over Units 1 through 6, our exam scores are representing the material from the entire AP course. And colleges and universities are going to expect students who have exam scores to know what happened in the 20th century. The events of the 1900s are going to play an important role in future classes, both in high school, if you're taking this before your US history class, and in university. But I think maybe even more importantly, it's because we live in a world today that is shaped by the events of the 20th century. And in order for you to be a participant in that world, it's important that you understand how your culture and customs and political system and all of the different aspects of our lives are shaped by the events of the 20th century. So we want to go ahead and take the time to learn about Units 8 and 9. And then around 2 weeks from now, we're going to begin studying all review for the AP test, reviewing materials between Units 1 and 6. That's going to start in the year 1200 and go up until the year 1900. Today, we're going to focus on Unit 8, Topic 3. And we're going to try to compare the ways in which the United States and the Soviet Union sought to maintain influence over the course of the Cold War. And while we're discussing this question of how these two separate states did similar and different things in order to wage the Cold War, we're going to use certain vocabulary. We're going to use vocabulary terms like mutually assured destruction, proxy war, and nuclear proliferation. Before we start answering the question of how did these two states fight the Cold War, let's ask the question of how did they distinctly not fight the Cold War? Yesterday, Mr. Laugereau mentioned to you that there was no direct fighting between the United States and the Soviet Union. We know that the Cold War is in fact called the Cold War because the two states never came into direct conflict with one another, which leads to a pretty obvious question: why? And the answer to that question revolves in the concept of the nuclear arms race. See, in 1945, at the end of World War II, the United States had demonstrated the ability to make and even the willingness to use atomic or nuclear weaponry. And the Soviet Union, while working really hard to develop these kinds of technologies, had no such technologies yet. But like we mentioned earlier, by 1950, the Soviet Union had demonstrated their ability to gain the technology. In 1955, just 10 years after the Cold War, the world or global landscape had changed because of nuclear weapons. The United States had over 2,000 nuclear warheads, and the Soviet Union had 200 nuclear warheads. Imagine the amount of destruction that could be caused by hundreds of nuclear warheads being dismissed from either or being launched by either the United States or the Soviet Union. And imagine how, as over the course of the next 30 years, or 40 years really, these two states are going to be competing with one another to see who can build more nuclear weapons and who can build better nuclear weapons. Just 10 years later, the United States had built more than 31,000 nuclear weapons, and the Soviet Union had more than 6,000 nuclear weapons. All of this goes to show and answer the question, why did the United States and the Soviet Union never come into direct military combat with one another? The reality is both sides had a very clear understanding that such a war could not be won. This is called mutually assured destruction. Both the Soviet Union and the United States avoided military conflict with one another because leaders in both states understood that a war like that cannot be won. Instead, both sides would face utter destruction. If they didn't wage the Cold War by fighting with one another through direct military combat, what were some of the ways that they fought with one another? One of the most common ways that they fought with one another was through the fight over Germany. Take a minute to think back through the first half of the 20th century and remember the Treaty of Versailles, which took place after World War I. After World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, which was crafted by the Allied powers was designed to place severe punishment on Germany. And that punishment damaged the economy and the culture and the people of Germany for decades. As a matter of fact, the Treaty of Versailles punished the people of Germany so intensely that it created the very situation and the very circumstances that allowed for the rise of Hitler and his fascist Nazi government. This is important because as the Allied powers began to discuss how to end World War II, they didn't want to create the same failure as the Treaty of Versailles. So instead, I'm sorry, guys. So instead, they decided to occupy Germany. In occupying Germany, the military forces of the winning sides would move into Germany and take over. And political leaders from both sides would come and try and help Germany establish a new, more successful, and ideally more peaceful government. Originally, you can see that Germany was divided up into four. The United States of America representing the orange, the France representing the blue, Britain representing the green, and the Soviet Union representing the red. However, both France and Britain had far too much to do to rebuild their own countries, and they didn't have the finances, energy, or resources to actually occupy a foreign state. They gave their sections over to the United States of America, and ultimately Germany was divided into two. They were divided into West Germany, occupied by the United States of America, who implemented systems like capitalism and democracy in order to establish a new government. And in the East, they were occupied by the Soviet Union, who implemented systems like totalitarianism and communism in order to create a new government. However, the city of Berlin, which you can see in the eastern side of Germany, was an important city for the occupation as well. Like Germany itself, it was first divided into four and later split up into only two. And the city of Berlin would be at the heart of where Germany and the Soviet Union would fight over their influence. See, totalitarian is a type of government that means that government has total control over the people. And that control is instituted through the usage of fear and violence. Essentially, the people in a totalitarian state need to have two options: obey the government or die. Unfortunately for the Soviet Union, having a Western Berlin in the middle of their Eastern Germany created a third option for many people who lived in Eastern Berlin: to obey the government, die, or escape. And that weakened the power of a totalitarian state. Through a series of back and forth between the Soviets and the Americans, there was fighting and arguments over whether or not America should have access to Western Berlin, how that access should be granted. Eventually, the Americans did something called the Berlin Airlift to bring in supplies to Berlin. And in 1961, the Soviet Union built the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall was built between Eastern and Western Berlin in order to keep Easterners under the totalitarian state. And it's considered the most significant and enduring symbol of the Cold War. Just look at the Berlin Wall and see for yourself. I'm going to give you just about 30 seconds. And in these 30 seconds, I'm going to ask you to make a claim. You're going to make a simple historical claim by looking at the Berlin Wall, and you're going to decide which is East and which is West. Remember, East Berlin is a totalitarian state supported or occupied by the Soviet Union and supporting a communist economic system. And West Berlin is a democratic state with capitalist economy occupied by the United States of America. Take about 30 seconds and think which is which. Okay, so Hopefully you're looking at the screen and you can see that on the right side is Western Berlin, the American occupied democratic capitalist part of Germany. And on the left side is Eastern Berlin, the Soviet Union occupied communist totalitarian part of Germany. Let's now take a second and look for specific pieces of evidence in the photograph to support our claims. So again, what is a specific piece of evidence on the right side to support the claim that that side is Western Berlin? And what is a specific piece of evidence on the left side to support the claim that that is Eastern Berlin? Hopefully when you look at the left side of the picture and you're looking for evidence to support the claim that that's a totalitarian communist state, you notice that there is a large barrier between the wall and a fence protecting that barrier from the wall. So that the average the average Eastern Berlin citizen can't just walk up to the wall. Hopefully you also notice that there's an armed military vehicle of some kind, followed by armed military troops patrolling the wall, protecting it from East Berliners. On the other side, on the right side, hopefully you notice the graffiti or the freedom of expression against the wall. The very idea that people were able to go up to the wall and express their culture, their customs, their thoughts, and their ideas. And you may have even noticed that there's a man walking close to the wall who seems to be even walking his dog, showing a freedom that existed on the Western side. Remember, the Berlin Wall is not just a literal divide between the Soviet Union and the United States and in Berlin, but it's also an enduring symbol for what the Cold War meant. And we can see the evidence of that symbol as we look at a picture ourselves. The Soviet Union and the United States of America also fought the Cold War through attempting to build alliances between communist and non-communist states. This started when the United States pursued creating the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, often referred to as NATO, was a defensive alliance designed to protect each other from communist aggression. The Atlantic Treaty Organization is made up of many European and North American states, each of which is its own independent state. Notice how close in Europe the North Atlantic Treaty Organization states are to the Soviet Union itself, especially states like Turkey and in the area of Western Europe. In response to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the Soviet Union established its own alliance as well. This alliance was called the Warsaw Pact. However, it's important to note that many of the states that joined in the Warsaw Pact didn't actually have their own political independence. They were under various degrees of direct political control and influence from the Soviet Union. Also take a moment to notice that there is no Warsaw Pact state in the Western Hemisphere, that the Warsaw Pact is all very close geographically to the Soviet Union. After the development of NATO, there were other regions of the world who also developed their own examples of non-communist defensive alliances. For example, SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. Possibly most significantly, this Cold War was fought through the idea of proxy wars. When we say there was no direct fighting between the two states, it's very important that we use the word direct, because it's just untrue to say that there was no fighting or no real fighting between the two states. The fighting between the Soviet Union and the United States of America was very real, and thousands of lives were lost in this fighting. So it's important to understand. However, most of the time, the direct combatants in these wars were not Americans and Soviets. They were African, Asians, and South Americans who were involved in their own civil wars over the direction of a new state. And the United States and the Soviet Union became involved in these wars in order to impose their own ideologies on these new states. Our first example is in Korea. Korea, like Germany, was occupied after World War II. This one was occupied in the northern region by the Soviet Union and in the southern region by the United States of America. Just like in Germany, the Soviet Union was looking to spread communism and totalitarian government, and in the southern region, the United States was looking to spread democracy and capitalism. The Korean War began when the North Koreans decided to invade South Korea in order to unite the entire peninsula under one political rule. And then over the next 3 years, the North and South Koreans went back and forth, gaining and losing territory on the Korean peninsula. And they did so with direct military support from the Soviets in the North and even the Chinese in the North, who had become a communist country, and in the South with the direct support and financial and military leadership of the United States of America. In the end, neither North Korea or South Korea was able to establish one political rule over Korea. Instead, both states established new governments with the legacy of their previous occupiers. North Korea became a communist totalitarian state, and South Korea became a capitalist democratic state. And the line dividing the two states was in a nearly identical place it was before the war began. Another proxy war took place in Vietnam. The Vietnamese War was a war for independence from the French Empire at first. And America was very, very loosely involved in giving the French assistance to keep their colony. However, as we mentioned before, it wasn't long after World War II that the French had to give up many different global endeavors in order to rebuild their own country. When the French pulled out, the United States of America stayed, and in the 1960s increased their involvement in Vietnam because of the American policy of containment. We've mentioned containment now today and yesterday already. Containment was the American policy of stopping the spread of communism at all costs. And the idea of containment was made even more serious by the threatening domino theory that once one Asian country fell to communism, all Asian countries would come after it, one after the next. China was the first, and Vietnam could be the next. The United States used a variety of different methods to be involved all the way until 1975 in the Vietnamese War, protecting the South Vietnamese against the communist nationalist leader north of North Vietnam called Ho Chi Minh. Ultimately, when the United States finally left Vietnam, it's important to note that communists took over the government there. A third significant proxy war took place in Cuba. The proxy war in Cuba was really significant because Cuba was the first communist state in the Western Hemisphere and served as a real geopolitical threat to the United States of America because it meant that communism was in our half of the world, but it also meant that communism was close enough to launch missiles that could attack and destroy new cities in the United States of America. Communism came to Cuba under the leadership of Fidel Castro, and the United States of, before I say that, let me remind you, we looked at the map just a moment ago, and it's important to remember that this threat of the enemy's military bases being so close to your shores was a new threat for the United States, but not a new threat for the Soviet Union. Remember, with the creation of NATO all the way back in the 1940s, Turkey had served as a United States military base with nuclear warheads as a threat to the Soviet Union. So Fidel Castro was the political communist leader of Cuba, and the United States of America sought to promote a coup d'etat or a rebellion against Fidel Castro. This rebellion, or coup d'etat, is called the Bay of Pigs. The Bay of Pigs was an attempt on the behalf of the American government to stir rebellion and revolution among the people of Cuba against Fidel Castro. For many different reasons, the Bay of Pigs was a failure. And the failure of the Bay of Pigs made the American government, in particular, the American president, John F. Kennedy, look weak on the international stage. And leaders like Fidel Castro and the Soviet Union leader, Nikita Khrushchev, saw this as an opportunity to take advantage of American weakness. This led to an event known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis took place when Americans discovered the Soviets were sending supplies to build missile launch sites in Cuba. The American president refused to respond to this weakly, noting that the extraordinary security risk it placed on the United States of America. And so he announced a blockade in the Atlantic Ocean. And he said to the Soviet Union, "Do not cross this blockade, or we will go to war with you." Many historians look at the Cuban Missile Crisis as the moment in world history where we became closest to full-blown, utterly destructive nuclear war. As the Soviets were creeping closer and closer and closer to the American blockade, Americans were standing at the ready, prepared to fire with the full force of the American military at the president's order. And just before it was going to be too late, the Soviets began to send signs that they were turning back and they were not going to cross the barricade. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended without nuclear war. And it's not only seen as the closest the country has ever been to nuclear war, but it's also thought of as a significant turning point in the process because it began to very slowly ease tensions and open up communication between the Soviets and the Americans. The most significant example of the opening of communication was the hotline, a direct line of communication between the White House, where the President of the United States lives, and the Kremlin, where the leader of the Soviet Union lives. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, there were several more examples of proxy wars. One example is in the African country of Angola. Angola was a Portuguese empire. It was a part of the Portuguese Empire, excuse me. If you'll take a moment and think back, what event intensified African imperialism European imperialism in Africa? What event intensified European imperialism in Africa? Hopefully, you thought of the Berlin Conference, which kicked off what's often referred to as the Scramble for Africa. It's important when you think about the Berlin Conference to remember that the only people there were European leaders, and their only interest was their personal financial gain. They were not looking for ways to aid Africa, help Africa, improve Africa. They were looking for ways to exploit Africa. As such, the boundaries they created there were about their own personal interests and the resources that existed in Africa. And they had nothing to do with the ethnicities, customs, cultures, or languages of the African people. That's actually very important in understanding how the war in Angola was so violent and troublesome and difficult to develop a new state. The United States and the Soviet Unions not only supported communist or non-communist leaders, they also picked an ethnicity, a group of people with common customs and heritage to support, which intensified the violence of the war in Angola. Another example of a proxy war is in Latin America. In Nicaragua in the 1980s, there was a war between a group called the Sandinistas and the Contras for the future, the direction of the country. And in this war, like many others across the world, the United States and the Soviet Union picked the sides based off of their own ideologies in order to hopefully produce the outcome that they most desired. Before we do our activity for the day, let's take a moment to review everything we talked about. So first of all, we talked about the global superpowers did not fight with one another directly. And the reason for this was called mutually assured destruction. The fact that the two states knew nobody could win, they could only lose such a war. We learned that since they didn't fight the war through direct military combat, they fought it through several other ways. One way was through nuclear proliferation, or racing one another to get nuclear technology and then build more nuclear weapons than the other. We also learned that they did it through building alliances. They spread their influence through building alliances. And they spread their influence through their control of Germany, and in particular, the Eastern German city known as Berlin. Finally, we learned that the two global superpowers sought to spread their influence through numerous proxy wars, taking a side based on their political or economic ideology in civil wars that were there to decide the direction of newly created states. Now let's take a couple of minutes to actually compare and contrast ways that the Soviet Union and the United States sought to provide influence over countries throughout the world. But before I do that, I want to talk to you about some rules for making genuine comparative statements. And in order to do that, I'm going to simplify our discussion by using something you might be a little bit more familiar with. Beyonce, global superstar Beyonce, and global pop group BTS. So here's two rules to follow when you make a comparative statement. One, a comparative statement must characterize both places being compared. If you asked me to compare Beyonce with BTS, I'm likely to say something like, Beyonce is the world's greatest living entertainer. She has a remarkable vocal range, extraordinary talent when it comes to dance and creative design. And then I'd have to stop because we only have 45 minutes together today, and I could do a whole live stream just on this. I've told you a whole lot about Beyonce, but what I haven't done is made any comparative statement. I may have implied that if Beyonce is the best living entertainer, then BTS can't also be the best living entertainment. But that's not a comparative statement. That's an implication, and therefore it's not a strong argument. In order for me to make a strong argument, I need to say something that brings up both Beyonce and BTS. So, for instance, I might say Beyonce has American heritage while BTS has Korean heritage. That would be a comparative statement. Or I could say Beyonce is a girl and BTS is a group. That follows the rule of bringing up both sides, but it breaks the next rule that we're going to talk about, which is that a comparative statement must make characterizations that fit in the same category. See, Beyonce's gender is not in the same category as the number of people in the group BTS, and therefore it is not a comparative statement. I could say Beyonce is a solo artist while BTS is a group of artists. And that would then be a comparative statement that characterizes both things being compared and makes a characterization that fits in the same category. It's really important that as you do tonight's assignment or tonight's exam preparation, you take the time to follow these two rules in every single one of your responses. If you provide a response that does not follow these two rules, then it is not an acceptable response. So let's look at our exam preparation for our practice that Mr. Logereau will go over at the beginning of tomorrow's lesson. Today, I'm giving you a short answer question that comes in 3 parts. 1, identify one similarity in the ways in which the United States and the Soviet Union sought to maintain influence over the course of the Cold War. B, Identify another similarity in the ways in which the United States and the Soviet Union sought to maintain influence over the course of the Cold War. And C, identify one difference in the ways in which the United States and the Soviet Union sought to maintain influence over the Cold War. Find time before tomorrow's lesson to provide one response to each of the 3 questions, and Mr. Logereau will give you possible answers tomorrow. Thank you all for tuning into today's live session. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I hope that you are better prepared for your AP exam and more knowledgeable about the 20th century. Have a wonderful evening.